Zak Brown has dropped a massive bombshell on the F1 world with some shocking accusations against his fellow team bosses. He's fired off a fierce statement, calling out what he sees as a blatant bias towards certain drivers. He's demanding changes to the way power is distributed within the sport. Now, F1 is known for being super exclusive. It's not like anyone can just waltz in and out as they please. Brown is worried that this exclusivity might actually lower the overall quality of the sport. He's also raising the question, does this closed-door policy open the way for newcomers, like Andretti, to make their mark? Team bosses in F1 are like royalty. They're some of the most respected figures, both within their teams and in the sport overall. Take Toto Wolff, for example. He's not just the boss of Mercedes F1, he owns a whopping 33% of the team. These bosses have a ton of influence, and Brown thinks they're not always using it for the right reasons. He accuses some of his rivals of pushing for rule changes that benefit their own teams rather than the sport as a whole. This, he argues, is not the way to ensure a fair and competitive environment. Instead, Brown calls for a shift in the power structure to prevent any single team from having too much influence over the rules and decisions that shape F1. As a prime example of this bias, just compare the penalty points of Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly. Last year, Gasly was on the verge of a race ban, while Norris faced a similar situation in 2021. Brown highlighted the inconsistent behavior of Otmar Szafnauer, who was the team principal of several F1 teams, most recently Alpine. The narrative has shifted dramatically. When Gasly was close to a race ban, there was a push to soften the rules. However, back in 2021, when Norris was on the edge, Szafnauer voted against any leniency for drivers nearing a ban. Brown described this as embarrassing and pointed out how this inconsistency plays out in team principal meetings. He also recounted how 2 years ago, they argued that most of Norris's penalty points weren't for dangerous driving. Szafnauer was completely against softening the rules then. Fast forward a year, and when Gasly was in the same situation, Szafnauer brought up the exact same argument that Brown had previously made. Of course, Brown called him out, saying, "Dude, you voted against us." This flip-flopping is unhealthy for the sport. It shows that what works for a team one year might not work the next, leading to inconsistent and unfair outcomes. Here's what he said. "Sometimes you win, and sometimes you lose. There may be times when we lose something in the short term because we would prefer to block a proposal. But in the long term, it would be better for the sport, and we would all benefit if we were in a sport where there is complete fairness and everyone has the same chances." Zak Brown pointed out another example of team principals using their influence as well. He noted that they had a significant say in how the cars should perform and even lobbied the FIA to soften the rules to address the porpoising issue. This issue was a problem for most teams, except Red Bull, which managed to comply with the regulations without any trouble. FIA President Ben Sulayem stated that penalizing Red Bull would have been unfair, since they had set a competitive example for the rest of the teams. Despite this, a couple of rules were introduced to slightly curb Red Bull's advantage, such as the porpoising sensors and flexi-floor structures. Brown believes this is part of a broader trend where team principals push for changes that primarily benefit their own interests, often at the expense of others on the grid. Brown wants to see this trend change sooner rather than later, as it undermines the fairness of the sport. He highlighted the inconsistency with Szafnauer as a prime example. Whether or not people agree with Brown's frequent critiques of Red Bull, instead of focusing solely on his own team's performance, he makes a valid point. This issue definitely deserves further discussion, as it highlights the need for a more balanced approach to rule changes in F1. Among the F1 team principals, who are a select group given the sport's elitist nature with only 10 teams, finding common ground is crucial for discussions related to the sport. A similar situation arose during a team principal meeting focusing on the porpoising issues. Toto Wolff and Christian Horner found themselves in a heated argument when Horner suggested that Mercedes should fix any issues with their car rather than constantly seeking FIA interventions. He implied that Mercedes was trying to add measures to catch up with Red Bull. This scenario echoes a similar incident from 2021 when Mercedes' pressure led to the installation of sensors on wheel guns in pit stops for safety reasons. This move came after Mercedes was losing time compared to Red Bull during pit stops. Helmut Marko accused Mercedes of pushing for something they didn't even believe was a genuine issue. Despite these efforts, Red Bull continues to achieve near-perfect pit stops. However, the implementation of these sensors has contributed to longer pit stops in general. The delay in the sensor turning green alone adds 2 to 3/10 of a second, which drivers now have to wait through, affecting race strategies. Once again, Brown has proposed a significant shift in the balance of power among F1 team principals, advocating for less influence in decision-making processes. He believes that F1 and the FIA should take a more active role in regulating these matters. As CEO and team principal of McLaren F1, the solution he gave was a revision to the voting system currently in place. He suggested moving away from the "what's good for me today" mentality often seen in votes, urging a step back to allow the FIA to regulate for the overall fairness of the sport. Now he knows that this approach might mean teams won't always get what they want in the short term, but stressed the importance of reducing the majority vote influence. He proposed a simpler 50% threshold for decisions, recognizing that conflicts of interest are inevitable among teams. Brown even hinted that F1 and the FIA should reclaim more authority to make decisions that they believe are best for the sport. He critiqued the current system, saying that sometimes teams are their own worst enemies. His call for reform raises questions about whether other team principals would support such a change, given their significant influence over regulations, policies, and even track preferences. Sponsors increasingly favor street circuits, which isn't always well received by fans and drivers alike. This trend's negative perception prompts speculation on whether team principals would unite to steer F1 away from this path, potentially prioritizing tracks that drivers genuinely enjoy racing on. The situation is crystal clear. F1 team principals are determined to maximize their current positions, and they may not readily embrace newcomers like Andretti, even if they bring massive potential benefits. Andretti, for instance, has made a strong case to Formula One management by proposing American sponsorships and an engine partnership with Cadillac. This could potentially expand the prize pool and inject fresh energy into the sport. But despite meeting all criteria and receiving approval from the FIA to enter F1, Andretti's bid faces lukewarm reception from existing team principals. This reluctance really tells you how existing interest within the sport can resist change, even when it promises new opportunities and growth. Whether it's Andretti or any other new entrant, the team principals' cautious approach shows their collective preference to maintain the status quo, despite potential benefits to the sport as a whole. The majority of F1 team principals have collectively opposed the idea of adding an 11th team, arguing that it wouldn't bring added value to the sport, at least not proven value. They cited examples like Haas to make their point clearer, noting how a team from the back of the grid managed to rise to midfield competitiveness through leadership and strategic direction changes. This stance highlights a crucial challenge ahead for F1 team principals, particularly as they approach the 2026 regulations. There are already conflicting requests among principals regarding engine changes, with voices like Christian Horner advocating for adjustments while others, like Toto Wolff, believe it's too late for such alterations. In light of these dynamics, Zak Brown's statements on reducing the power of team principals raise important questions. Do these figures have too much influence, potentially hindering the sport's evolution? Is there a scenario where their influence could be curtailed despite their pivotal roles within their teams? These are critical discussions shaping the future of F1, reflecting broader debates about governance and fairness in elite sports. What are your thoughts on this issue? Let us know in the comments below.